Kicked out at 16, an orphan inherits a dusty lighthouse. What she found inside would change everything. If you've ever felt lost, like the world had already decided who you were, then stick around. This story is for you. Hit that subscribe button, because we're about to talk about what it really means to find your way home. The air in the administrative office of the St. Jude's Home for Girls tasted like stale paper and quiet desperation. It was a taste I had known for 2 years, ever since the day they told me Grandma Rose was gone. Today, however, was different. Today was my 18th birthday, which meant it was also my eviction day. Ms. Albright, the home's director, sat across her impossibly clean desk from me, her smile as thin and brittle as a dried leaf. She slid a manila envelope across the polished wood. It made a soft, final sound. "This is it, Ilara. Everything the state has for you. Your birth certificate, social security card, and your final stipend. $250. Use it wisely." I stared at the envelope. It felt too light to hold a future, too thin to contain a life. 2 years of my life. 2 years of eating beige food under fluorescent lights, of sleeping in a room with 3 other girls whose ghosts haunted them as much as mine haunted me. And it all came down to this: a flimsy paper packet and enough money to maybe cover a bus ticket and a week at a hostel, if I was lucky. "There's one other thing," she said, her voice softening just a fraction, a professional courtesy she reserved for final exits. She pushed a second, much older-looking envelope toward me. It was thick, creamy parchment, yellowed at the edges, with a black wax seal I'd only ever seen in movies. My name, Ilara Vance, was written on the front in an elegant, looping script that I didn't recognize. "This came for you about a month ago, from a law firm. We were instructed to give it to you on your 18th birthday, no sooner." I picked it up. It was heavy, not just in weight, but in significance. It felt like it had traveled through time to find me. The wax seal was embossed with a stylized A. I turned it over in my hands, the rough texture of the old paper a stark contrast to the sterile smoothness of Ms. Albright's desk. "A law firm?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Do you know what it's about?" She gave a slight shake of her head. "We don't open residence mail, Ilara. You know that." Of course, the rules. St. Jude's was built on rules, a scaffolding of regulations designed to hold up girls who were falling apart. I tucked the letter into the inner pocket of my worn denim jacket, the one thing I owned that felt truly mine. It was Grandma Rose's. It still smelled faintly of her, a mix of sea salt and lavender. "Well," Ms. Albright said, standing up. "The interview was over. My time was up. Good luck, Ilara. We wish you the best." The words were automatic, a pre-recorded message played for every girl who aged out of the system. I stood, my single duffel bag slung over my shoulder. It contained 2 changes of clothes, a worn copy of Moby Dick that my grandmother used to read to me, and now 2 envelopes. One held my meager, state-sanctioned future. The other held a mystery. I walked out of her office, down the long linoleum hallway that had echoed with my footsteps for 730 days. I didn't look back. The front doors of St. Jude's hissed open and then clicked shut behind me, the sound as definitive as a gavel strike. I was free, and I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The city air hit me first, thick with exhaust fumes and the smell of hot pavement. It was a world away from the sanitized, recycled air of the home. I walked for 3 blocks without a destination, the weight of the duffel bag digging into my shoulder. Then I found a small park, a sad little patch of green squeezed between 2 concrete giants. I sat on a bench, the wood warm from the afternoon sun, and finally pulled out the strange letter. My fingers trembled as I broke the wax seal. Inside, the paper was just as thick, the letterhead embossed with Abernathy and Sons, Legal Counselors, Port Blossom, Maine. Maine? I'd never been to Maine. My grandmother and I had lived in a small apartment 2 states south. I unfolded the single sheet of paper and began to read. The language was formal, dense with legal terms that swam before my eyes. But I caught the important words. Last will and testament, Rose Vance, sole beneficiary. And then, the phrase that made my heart stop. The property known as Granite Point Lighthouse and its adjoining keeper's cottage. A lighthouse. My grandmother, the woman who had lived on instant noodles and mended her clothes until they were more patch than fabric, had owned a lighthouse? It made no sense. We were poor. Not just regular poor, but the kind of poor where a single unexpected bill could capsize your entire life. That's what they told me had happened. That she'd had a medical emergency, no insurance, and the debt had swallowed everything. That's why I'd ended up at St. Jude's. The letter instructed me to contact a Mr. Elias Abernathy to discuss the particulars of my inheritance. It listed a phone number. I stared at the paper for a long time, the city noise fading into a dull roar. A lighthouse. The image it conjured was so impossibly romantic, so far removed from the gritty reality of my life, that it felt like a prank. A cruel joke played on the orphan girl on her first day of homelessness. But the paper in my hands was real. The embossed letters were real. The faint, musty smell of old documents was real. I pulled out the other envelope, the one from the state. $250. It wasn't a future, but maybe, just maybe, it was a bus ticket to a past I never knew I had. I took a deep breath, the city air tasting a little different now. It still tasted of desperation, but underneath, for the first time in 2 years, there was a tiny, unfamiliar hint of hope. The bus ride to Port Blossom, Maine, was a 20-hour journey through the frayed edges of America. I watched cities bleed into sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into endless stretches of farmland, and finally, thickened into the dense, dark forests of the north. With every mile, the air grew colder, cleaner. It smelled of pine and damp earth, a scent so different from the concrete and exhaust I was used to. I spent the time staring out the window, the letter from Mr. Abernathy folded and unfolded in my pocket, until its creases were soft as cloth. I had called him from a payphone at the bus station, my voice small and uncertain. His was the opposite, a low, calm rumble, like stones rolling in a slow tide. He hadn't sounded surprised to hear from me. He sounded like he'd been waiting. "Ah, Miss Vance, Elara. I'm glad you called. Your grandmother was very specific about the timing. Can you make your way to Port Blossom?" I told him I could. He gave me the address of his office and told me to come see him the moment I arrived. Now, as the bus wheezed into the small coastal town, I felt a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. Port Blossom wasn't much more than a single main street hugging a rocky harbor. Fishing boats with peeling paint bobbed in the gray water, their reflections shivering on the surface. The buildings were old, clad in weathered clapboard, their windows staring out at the sea like weary eyes. It was beautiful, in a stark, lonely sort of way. Mr. Abernathy's office was on the second floor of one of these buildings, above a bait and tackle shop that smelled powerfully of brine and decay. The stairs creaked under my feet, and the door to his office had a small brass plaque that read, E. Abernathy, Attorney at Law. I knocked, and his voice called out, "Come in." The office was a chaotic temple of paper. Books were crammed into every shelf, Files were stacked in precarious towers on the floor, and the huge wooden desk in the center was nearly invisible under a landslide of documents. The man sitting behind it looked exactly as his voice had sounded. He was older, with a thick mane of white hair and a face etched with the kind of deep lines that come from a lifetime of frowning at legal text. But his eyes, when he looked up at me over his spectacles, were kind. "Miss Vance," he said, standing up. He was a tall man, slightly stooped. "Welcome to Port Blossom. Please, have a seat. Forgive the mess. It's an organized chaos, I assure you." I sat in the worn leather chair opposite him. It sighed as I sank into it. "Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Abernathy." "Elias, please," he said, gesturing around the room. "Formality seems a bit much in a place like this." He spent a few moments shuffling papers, finally unearthing a thick blue folder. He opened it, and I saw my grandmother's name at the top of the first page. "All right, Ilara, let's get to it. Your grandmother, Rose, was a client of mine for many years, a very determined woman. She left you everything, the sole heir to her estate." He paused, looking at me. "The estate consists of one asset, the Granite Point property. That's the lighthouse, the keeper's cottage, and the 2 acres of land it sits on." I just nodded, unable to speak. It was still so hard to believe. "Now," he continued, his tone shifting, becoming more cautious, "there are some complications. The property comes with significant liabilities." He pulled out a separate sheet of paper. It was a long column of numbers. "These are the back taxes owed to the town and the county. Rose, she fell behind, very far behind." He slid the paper across the desk. The number at the bottom made me feel dizzy. It was more money than I could possibly imagine. I don't understand," I stammered. "If she had this place, why were we—" "Poor?" He finished the sentence gently. "That's the heart of the matter, isn't it?" He leaned back in his chair, the old leather groaning in protest. "It's a long story, Ilara, and honestly, I only know parts of it. Rose was a very private person. What I do know is that she fought tooth and nail to keep that property in the family. It meant the world to her. But fighting costs money." He then pulled out another envelope, this one modern and crisp, bearing the logo of a company called Coastal Horizons, LLC. "Which brings us to this," he said, his voice flat. "This is a standing offer to purchase the property. It's been on the table for over a year. Rose refused to even look at it." He slid the offer over to me. This time the number was an offer, not a debt. It was a life-changing amount of money, enough to pay the taxes 10 times over and still have enough to start a new life, a real life, anywhere I wanted. "They want to tear down the lighthouse," he said, watching my face. "Build a luxury resort, golf course, marina, the whole 9 yards. This offer would solve all your problems, Ilara. You could pay the tax arrears and walk away with a very, very substantial nest egg. No one would blame you. In fact, most people would say you'd be a fool not to take it." I looked from the tax bill to the offer letter. One represented a crushing, impossible burden. The other, an instant escape. It was the easiest choice in the world. So why did it feel so wrong? "Why didn't she sell?" I asked, my voice quiet. "If she needed the money that badly, why didn't she just sell?" Mr. Abernathy gave me a long, searching look. "That, my dear, is the question, and I suspect the answer is waiting for you out at the lighthouse." He handed me a large, rusty iron key. It was heavy in my palm, its teeth worn smooth with age. The property is about a 3-mile walk up the coast road. You can't miss it. It's the only thing out there. I took the key. It felt like I was accepting more than just access to a building. It felt like I was accepting the weight of the question itself. The walk to Granite Point was a battle against the wind. It swept in off the ocean, cold and relentless, smelling of salt and wet rock. The road was a narrow strip of cracked asphalt that clung to the edge of the cliffs. On one side, the dark, churning Atlantic gnawed at the shore. On the other, a dense wall of spruce and pine trees clawed at the sky. There were no other cars, no other people, just the cry of the gulls and the roar of the surf. It was a lonely place, a place that felt like the end of the world. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. At first, it was just a white sliver against the bruised purple of the evening sky. But as I got closer, it resolved into a tower, the Granite Point Lighthouse. It stood on the furthest tip of the peninsula, a solitary sentinel against the vastness of the ocean. It was taller than I had imagined, a graceful white column rising from a brutal foundation of dark gray rock. It wasn't pristine. The paint was peeling in long strips, like sunburnt skin, and dark stains of rust bled down from the metalwork of the lantern room. Next to it, nestled in its shadow, was a small stone cottage, its roof sagging in the middle like a tired old horse. The windows were dark and empty. The whole place looked abandoned, forgotten. But it was also the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. There was a low stone wall around the property, and a rusted iron gate hanging crookedly on one hinge. I pushed it open, the screech of the metal a protest against the wind. The path to the cottage was overgrown with weeds, their tendrils wrapping around my ankles as I walked. The air here was different, sheltered from the main force of the wind. It was still and heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else, something floral and sweet, like long-dead roses. I stood before the cottage door, a solid-looking thing made of thick, weathered wood. The iron key Mr. Abernathy had given me was cold and heavy in my hand. For a moment, I hesitated. This was it, the threshold. The moment I crossed it, nothing would be the same. I was afraid of what I would find inside. Ghosts, disappointment, an emptiness that mirrored my own. But I was more afraid of not knowing. I was more afraid of taking the easy money and spending the rest of my life wondering what answers this place had held. I slid the key into the lock. It was stiff, and I had to put my whole body into turning it. With a loud, groaning clunk, the lock gave way. I pushed the door open. It swung inward on a single shrieking hinge, revealing a darkness that seemed to swallow the fading light. The air that rushed out was thick and musty, the smell of trapped time. It was the smell of dust, of mildew, of wood rot, and underneath it all, that same faint, familiar scent from my jacket. Salt and lavender. The smell of my grandmother. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into near total darkness. I was home. Or at least, I was in the place where home was supposed to be. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden, oppressive silence. I fumbled along the wall, my fingers brushing against peeling wallpaper and cold, damp stone, searching for a light switch. My hand found one, a brittle old toggle switch. I flicked it up. Nothing. Of course. The power would have been cut off years ago. The last of the daylight was filtering through the grimy window panes, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. As my eyes adjusted, the space began to take shape. I was in a small living area. Every surface was coated in a thick gray blanket of dust. Furniture huddled in the center of the room, draped in white sheets like a family of ghosts. A stone fireplace stood against one wall, its hearth filled with ash and charred logs from a fire that had gone out long ago. It was a scene of perfect, undisturbed decay. I walked slowly into the room, my boots leaving clean prints in the dust. I reached out and pulled the sheet off a lumpy shape. It was a large, overstuffed armchair, its floral pattern faded to a pale ghost of its former self. This was her chair. I knew it instantly. I could almost see her sitting there, her knitting needles clicking, the copy of Moby Dick open in her lap. The memory was so vivid, it was painful. I moved through the small cottage, room by room. The kitchen was tiny, with a rusty cast-iron stove and shelves lined with jars of what looked like preserved vegetables, their contents now a murky brown. The bedroom was just as small, containing only a simple iron bed frame and a wooden dresser. Everything was covered in that same layer of dust, that same sense of suspended time. It was a place of deep poverty, that much was clear. The furniture was old and worn, the few decorations simple and handmade. It didn't look like the home of someone who owned a lighthouse. It looked like the home of someone who was barely surviving. And yet, there was a feeling in the air. It wasn't sadness, not exactly. It was love. I could feel it in the way a worn-out quilt was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. I could see it in the collection of smooth gray stones arranged on the windowsill, each one a perfect, sea-worn oval. This place had been cared for, deeply. My search felt aimless, hopeless. What was I even looking for? A clue? An answer to a question I barely knew how to ask. I returned to the main living area as the last of the light failed, the room sinking into a deep, velvety darkness. I sat in the dusty armchair, my grandmother's chair, and for the first time since I'd left St. Jude's, I let myself cry. I cried for the grandmother I had lost. I cried for the years I had spent in the system, feeling abandoned and alone. And I cried for the confusion that was churning inside me, a storm that rivaled the one brewing outside. As I sat there, my hand slipped down the side of the armchair cushion. My fingers brushed against something hard and wooden. I felt around, my heart starting to beat a little faster. Tucked deep into the side of the chair, hidden from view, was a small wooden box. It wasn't a jewelry box. It was a simple, unadorned thing, but I could feel that it was locked. I pulled it out, my fingers tracing its dusty surface in the dark. It was too dark to see properly, but I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was it. This was what I had come here to find. I spent the night in the cottage, sleeping fitfully on the dusty mattress of the iron bed. The wind howled around the stone walls, and the sea crashed against the rocks below, a constant, thunderous heartbeat. I clutched the small wooden box to my chest, its hard edges a comfort in the overwhelming dark. When the first gray light of dawn seeped through the dirty windows, I was already awake. I took the box back into the main room and sat on the floor, turning it over and over in my hands. It was made of dark wood, possibly teak, and was bound with tarnished brass fittings. The lock was small and intricate. There was no key. I searched the cottage again, this time with a specific purpose. I looked in every jar in the kitchen, under the mattress, in the pockets of an old coat hanging by the door. Nothing. Frustrated, I went outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky washed clean and a world that glittered with moisture. The air was sharp and cold. I walked over to the base of the lighthouse tower. The door was even more formidable than the cottage door, made of thick iron and painted a faded, peeling red. The lock was huge and industrial. I wondered if the heavy key Mr. Abernathy had given me was for this door, not the cottage. I tried it. It slid in perfectly. With a groan of rusted metal, the lock turned, and the heavy door swung open. The air that flowed out was completely different from the cottage. It was cool and dry, and it smelled of oil, metal, and ozone. I stepped inside, into the base of the tower. It was a single, circular room, its curved walls made of massive, fitted stones. In the center, a spiral staircase made of wrought iron corkscrewed its way up into the darkness above. The only light came from the open doorway and a few small, grimy portholes set high in the wall. The room was a workshop. Tools hung in neat rows on the walls. There were cans of grease, coils of rope, and spare parts for machinery I couldn't identify. Unlike the cottage, this space was orderly, functional. It felt like a sacred place, a place of serious work. Against one wall was a simple wooden desk and a chair. On the desk, laid out with perfect precision, was a set of old brass keys on a simple metal ring. One of them was small and ornate, a perfect match for the lock on the box. My hands were shaking as I picked up the keys and hurried back to the cottage. I sat on the floor, inserted the small brass key into the lock on the wooden box, and turned. It clicked open. I lifted the lid. The box was filled to the brim with letters, dozens of them, bundled together with faded ribbon. On top of the first bundle was a single sealed envelope addressed to me. To Ilara. I lifted it out. The paper was crisp, the handwriting shaky but familiar. It was my grandmother's. I opened it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The letter began, "My dearest Ilara, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have come home. I am so sorry, my love, for everything." I had to stop and take a breath, the words blurring through a sudden film of tears. I continued reading. She explained that the story I had been told was a lie. A necessary lie, she called it. She hadn't lost everything to medical debt. The truth was far more complicated. The lighthouse, she wrote, had been in our family for generations. But her husband, my grandfather, a man I'd never met, had been a gambler. He had taken out a secret predatory loan against the property, using it as collateral for a debt he could never repay. When he died, that debt fell to her. The lenders were not a bank. They were dangerous men. For years, she had fought them. She worked 3 jobs, sending them every spare penny she had, just to keep them at bay. But it was never enough. They started to threaten her, and then they started to threaten me. "They watched you at the schoolyard, my love," she wrote. "They told me what you were wearing. They knew your favorite flavor of ice cream. I realized then that I couldn't protect you and the lighthouse. I had to choose. And I chose you, Ilara. I always chose you. The only way to get me away from them, to make them believe she had nothing left to lose, was to give me up. She had arranged it all, making it look like a financial collapse. She had paid a social worker to ensure I was placed in a good home, far away. The pain of it, she wrote, had nearly broken her. "Every day without you was a year in winter," the letter said. "But I knew you were safe, and that was the only thing that mattered. I spent the next years of my life working to pay off that debt. I lived on nothing. I saved every cent. Not for me, but to cleanse this place. to make it safe for you to one day return to. The letter ended with an instruction. She told me to look for a loose floorboard under the bed in the cottage. She said everything I needed to understand was there. I put the letter down, my mind reeling. Abandonment. The word had defined my life for 2 years. I had felt thrown away, a piece of trash left on the curb. But it wasn't abandonment. It was a shield. It was a desperate, painful act of protection. It was a sacrifice of almost unimaginable proportions. The whole narrative of my life had just been shattered and rebuilt in the span of 10 minutes. I felt a surge of emotions so powerful they almost knocked me over. Anger at my grandfather, a wave of profound, heartbreaking love for my grandmother, and a deep, aching grief for the years we had lost. I crawled into the small bedroom and felt around the rough wooden floorboards beneath the iron bed frame. One of them was loose. I pried it up with my fingers. Beneath it was a cavity, and inside that cavity was a metal box. It was a simple cash box, the kind you'd buy at an office supply store. It wasn't locked. I lifted the lid. It was filled with papers. The first was a deed to the property, free and clear, with a stamp of release dated just 6 months before her death. She had done it. She had paid it all off. Beneath that were bank statements, withdrawal slips, and stacks of receipts for money orders sent to a holding company I'd never heard of. It was a meticulous, heartbreaking record of her lonely war. And at the very bottom of the box, there was something else, bundles of cash. Old, worn bills wrapped in rubber bands. I counted it. It wasn't a fortune. It was a little over $5,000. Her life savings, the last of her ammunition. An envelope was tucked in with the money. Inside was a short note. For the taxes and for a new beginning. Make it a good one, my love. All my love, Grandma Rose. I sat there on the floor of the dusty, cold cottage, holding the evidence of my grandmother's secret life, of her incredible sacrifice. The $5,000 felt heavier than the developer's multi-million-dollar offer. That was just money. This was paid for in time, in loneliness, in heartbreak. This was the price of my safety. This was the true inheritance. And as I sat there, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could take this money, add it to the fortune from coastal horizons, and walk away from this place of sacrifice and sorrow forever. I could have the easy life she seemingly died to give me. Or I could stay. I could use this small pile of cash to begin my own fight. I could pour my life into this place, just as she had. I could honor her sacrifice not by running away from it, but by embracing it. I looked around the small, dusty room. It wasn't an inheritance of property. It was an inheritance of purpose. Have you ever reached a moment like that? A moment where the story you told yourself about your own life turned out to be completely wrong. When you realize a betrayal was actually a protection, or a loss was actually a gift. It's a moment that can break you, or it can set you free. If you've ever felt that, I want you to know you're not alone. This community we're building here, it's for people who get it. People who know that the most important stories are the ones hidden beneath the floorboards. If this is hitting you, if you're still with me on this journey, just type, "I'm still here," in the comments below. It means the world to know we're in this together. Now, let's get back to what happened next. The next few days were a blur of dust and discovery. I didn't think about the offer from Coastal Horizons. I didn't think about Mr. Abernathy. I just immersed myself in the world my grandmother had left for me. I started by cleaning. It was a monumental task. I began in the cottage, armed with a bucket I found in the Lighthouse workshop and a few old rags. I hauled water from a hand pump over a well I discovered behind the cottage. The water was icy cold and tasted of minerals, but it was clear. I scrubbed the floors, washed the windows, and beat the dust out of the old rugs until my arms ached. With every layer of grime I removed, it felt like I was bringing the place back to life, letting it breathe again. And as I cleaned, I read. Every evening as the sun set and filled the small cottage with golden light, I would sit in her armchair and read the letters from the wooden box. They were not for me. They were letters she had written to my grandfather after he was gone. They were a one-sided conversation that spanned years. In them, she poured out her heart. She wrote about her anger at him for his weakness, for the mess he had left behind. She wrote about her fear of the men who came to collect, their cold eyes and veiled threats. She wrote about her struggle to find work, her exhaustion, the constant, gnawing hunger. And she wrote about me. She described my first steps, the funny things I said, the way my hair caught the light. She wrote about reading Moby Dick to me, how my eyes would get wide at the parts about the great white whale. These pages were filled with a love so fierce and protective it felt like a physical force. "I see your recklessness in her, Thomas," she wrote in one letter. "But I also see my strength. She is the best of us, and I will not let your ghosts drag her down into the sea with you." Through her words, I got to know the grandmother I'd only known as a child. I saw her not just as a loving caregiver, but as a warrior, a quiet, relentless fighter who stood against a tide of darkness and refused to be swept away. And I finally understood the lighthouse. It wasn't just property, it was a symbol. It was the one solid, unbreakable thing in her life. It was her anchor, her fortress. Protecting it was about more than land or money. It was about preserving the one part of her world that hadn't been tainted by my grandfather's mistakes. It was about legacy. As I worked, the place began to reveal more of its secrets. In the workshop at the base of the lighthouse, I found her journals. They were different from the letters, more practical. They were filled with notes on maintaining the light, even though it had been decommissioned for years. She had meticulously cared for the lens, polished the brass, and greased the clockwork mechanism that made it turn. She had treated it not as a relic, but as a living thing that needed her care. One entry, dated from about a year after I was taken, stood out. "The men from the company came today, the ones who want to build their glass boxes by the sea. They offered a fortune. I told them to leave. They don't understand. You don't sell your own heart." That line hit me hard. You don't sell your own heart. That's what Coastal Horizons was asking me to do. They weren't just buying 2 acres of rock. They were buying her struggle, her sacrifice. They were offering to pave over her heart and put up a parking lot. A week after my arrival, I made the 3-mile walk back into town. Port Blossom felt different now. It no longer seemed lonely, just quiet. I went to the small general store to buy supplies with some of the money from the cash box. The woman behind the counter, a sturdy-looking woman with kind eyes named Martha, looked at me curiously. "You're the Vance girl, aren't you?" she asked. "Staying out at the Point?" I nodded, surprised. "News travels fast." "It's a small town," she said with a shrug. We all knew Rose, a tough woman, kept to herself mostly. We were all sorry to hear she'd passed. As she rang up my groceries, bread, cheese, coffee, and a box of candles, she hesitated. "You thinking of selling that place to the developers?" The question was casual, but her eyes were sharp. "Everyone in town is wondering." "I haven't decided," I said, which was a lie. I had decided. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. "Well," she said, bagging my things, "for what it's worth, a lot of us hope you don't. That lighthouse has been there forever. It's a part of this town. We'd hate to see it replaced by some rich folk playground." Her words were another small weight on the scales, another confirmation of what I was already feeling. This wasn't just my fight. It belonged to this place, to this community I was only just discovering. My last stop was Mr. Abernathy's office. He looked up when I walked in, and a flicker of surprise crossed his face. "Ilara, I was wondering when I'd hear from you. Have you had a chance to consider the offer?" I walked up to his desk and placed the rusty iron key on top of a stack of papers. "I'm not selling," I said. The words came out stronger, clearer than I expected. "I'm staying." He stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He looked from me to the key and back again. Then a slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I had a feeling your grandmother's granddaughter might say that," he said. "So," he leaned forward, all business now. "You're staying. That means we have a fight on our hands. The back taxes are our first priority. We'll need to set up a payment plan with the town. It won't be easy. They'll want a significant down payment." I reached into my bag and pulled out the cash box. I opened it and placed it on his desk. "My grandmother left this, for the taxes." He looked at the bundles of worn bills, and his professional demeanor cracked. He looked genuinely moved. "Rose," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "She never quit, not for a second." He looked back up at me, his eyes shining. "This will be enough to show the town council you're serious. It will buy us time." He paused, then opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. "Your grandmother also left this with me. She said I was to give it to you only if you decided to stay." It was a ship's logbook, old and heavy. The title on the cover was embossed in gold leaf. "Granite Point Log, 1888 to present." "She said all the ammunition you'd ever need was in here," he said. "She said the lighthouse has its own story, and it's a story worth fighting for." I took the logbook. It felt like a weapon, a shield. The story of this place, the story of my family. I had made my choice. I was no longer the girl who was aging out of the system. I was the keeper of the Granite Point Lighthouse. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The first town council meeting was as intimidating as I had imagined. It was held in a small, wood-paneled room at the back of the town hall. The air was thick with the smell of old coffee and civic duty. The council was made up of 5 people who looked like they had been carved from the granite cliffs themselves. 3 older men with weathered faces and 2 stern-looking women. They sat behind a long table, looking down at me where I stood with Mr. Abernathy. He did most of the talking. He presented the cashier's check for $5,000, explaining it was a down payment on the delinquent taxes. He spoke of my commitment to restoring the property, to honoring my family's legacy. I could feel their skepticism. To them, I was just a kid from away, an outsider who had inherited a problem. One of the men, a gruff fisherman named Silas Blackwood, who was the head of the council, leaned into his microphone. "A $5,000 payment on a debt of over $50,000 is a nice gesture, Mr. Abernathy. But it's a drop in the bucket. Coastal Horizons is offering to pay the full amount immediately and invest millions into this town." He turned his gaze to me. "Young lady, do you have any idea what you're getting into? That place is a ruin. It'll take a fortune to make it livable, let alone pay off the debt. Why not take the money and start a real life for yourself." His tone wasn't unkind, but it was patronizing. He saw me as a fool, a sentimental child. My voice trembled when I spoke, but I held his gaze. "Sir, with all due respect, I am starting a real life. That lighthouse, that's my home. It's the only one I have. My grandmother fought her whole life to keep it. I'm not going to be the one who gives it up." I held up the logbook. This property was deeded to my family on the condition that they would always keep a light for the sailors of this coast. That's a promise I intend to honor. There was a murmur in the small audience of townspeople who had come to watch. Mr. Abernathy had suggested I read the logbook, and I had spent the last 2 nights poring over it. It was a history of the point, filled with stories of shipwrecks, storms, and rescues. It was also a legal document, filled with deeds, covenants, and forgotten town ordinances. My grandmother had underlined a key passage about a historic preservation clause in the original town charter. Mr. Abernathy presented this to the council. The clause stated that any structure deemed essential to the town's maritime history could not be demolished without a unanimous vote and a public referendum. The lighthouse, he argued, was the very definition of such a structure. The mood in the room shifted. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about history, about identity. The council agreed, reluctantly, to accept the payment and grant me a 6-month extension to present a viable plan for paying the remaining debt and restoring the property. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As we left, Martha from the general store gave me a nod of encouragement. A few other people smiled at me. I was still an outsider, but maybe not for much longer. The next few months were the hardest and most rewarding of my life. I used the last of my grandmother's money to buy tools and supplies. I learned how to patch a roof, replace a window pane, and mix mortar to repoint the old stone walls. I worked from sunrise to sunset, my body aching, my hands raw and blistered. The physical labor was cleansing. With every rotten board I tore out, with every fresh coat of paint I applied, I felt like I was healing not just the house, but myself. I also started a new project. Inspired by the logbook, I began researching the history of the lighthouse and the town. I spent hours at the tiny local library, digging through archives. I discovered that Granite Point had been the site of a famous rescue in the winter of 1922, where my great-great-grandfather had rowed out in a blizzard to save the crew of a schooner that had wrecked on the rocks. The story was a local legend, but it had been largely forgotten. I decided to bring it back. Using an old laptop Mr. Abernathy gave me, I started a simple website, a blog. I called it the Granite Point Project. I started writing about the history of the lighthouse, sharing excerpts from the logbook and old photographs I had found. I wrote about the restoration work I was doing, posting before and after pictures of the cottage. And I wrote about my grandmother, about her secret fight, and about what the lighthouse meant to me. I didn't expect anyone to read it. But then, something amazing happened. A local newspaper reporter found the blog and wrote a small article about my story. That article was picked up by a larger regional paper. Then a historical society in Boston shared it on their social media. Suddenly, people were paying attention. Emails started coming in. People from all over the country, descendants of sailors who had been guided by the Granite Point Light, sent messages of support. A woman whose grandfather was one of the men rescued in the 1922 blizzard sent a donation of $500. A small preservation group offered to send a team of volunteers for a weekend to help with the restoration work. The blog started to get a few hundred visitors a day, then a few thousand. I added a small donate button to the website, and to my astonishment, money started to trickle in. $5 here, $20 there. It wasn't a lot, but it was something. It was hope. One afternoon, a pickup truck rumbled up the coast road. It was Silas Blackwood, the head of the town council. He got out, holding a toolbox. He didn't say much. He just looked at the new roof I was patching on the cottage and said, "You're using the wrong kind of flashing for this coastal weather. It'll rust out in 2 years." For the next 4 hours, he worked alongside me, showing me the proper way to seal the roof against the salt and the wind. As he was leaving, he grunted, "My grandfather was the lighthouse keeper here before yours. This place matters." It was his way of saying he was on my side. It was a turning point. The community, once skeptical, began to rally around the project. Martha organized a bake sale at the general store to raise funds. A group of fishermen volunteered to help me clear the overgrown land. The fight was no longer just mine. It was ours. Of course, Coastal Horizons didn't give up. They sent lawyers. They challenged the historical preservation clause. They tried to portray me as a naive squatter holding up progress. But now, when I went to the town meetings, I wasn't alone. The room was filled with supporters. The story of Granite Point had become the story of Port Blossom. A story of a small town fighting to hold on to its soul against a faceless corporation. The final confrontation came at the end of my 6-month extension. The council had to vote on whether my plan was viable. By then, through the blog and local fundraising, I had raised almost half of the remaining tax money. I presented a detailed proposal, co-written with Mr. Abernathy, to turn the keeper's cottage into a small seasonal museum and a one-room bed and breakfast, creating a sustainable income to pay the rest of the debt and cover the lighthouse's upkeep. The Coastal Horizons lawyer gave a slick presentation filled with promises of jobs and tax revenue. But his words rang hollow in that small room. When it came time to vote, Silas Blackwood was the first to speak. "This town has a choice," he said, his voice booming. "We can sell our history for a golf course, or we can invest in it. We can invest in our own. I vote to support the Granite Point project." The vote was unanimous. The room erupted in applause. I just stood there, tears streaming down my face. We had won. The lighthouse was safe. That night, for the first time, I climbed the winding iron staircase all the way to the top of the lighthouse. I stepped out into the lantern room. The great Fresnel lens, which my grandmother had so lovingly polished, filled the center of the space, its thousands of prisms ready to capture and focus a light that was no longer there. The view was breathtaking. The endless dark ocean stretched out to the horizon, and the lights of Port Blossom twinkled in the distance like a fallen constellation. The wind whipped around the glass, but inside it was perfectly still. I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From the sterile hallway of St. Jude's to this magnificent, sacred space. I had arrived with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of grief. I thought inheritance was about money, about property. But I was wrong. My grandmother hadn't left me a building. She had left me a story. She hadn't left me a fortune. She had left me a fight. And in taking up that fight, I had found everything I had been missing. I had found a purpose. I had found a community. I had found a home, not just in the stones and mortar of the lighthouse, but within myself. The girl who felt thrown away was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her own strength, a woman who knew where she belonged. The restoration is still ongoing. There are years of work ahead. The museum isn't open yet, and the debt isn't fully paid. This isn't a fairy tale ending where all the problems magically disappear. This is real life. It's hard, and it's slow, but it's good. Every morning I wake up to the sound of the sea. I make coffee, and watch the lobster boats head out of the harbor. I spend my days working with my hands, bringing this place back to its former glory. Some nights, I sit in my grandmother's armchair and read her letters, not with sadness, but with gratitude. She gave me more than a lighthouse. She gave me a compass. She showed me the way home. My story started with an ending, with being aged out, kicked out, left on my own. But that ending was really a beginning. It was a chance to build something new, something that mattered. I look out from the top of this tower, and I don't see an empty ocean. I see a future filled with possibility. I see a light waiting to be rekindled. What I want you to take away from this, what I've learned standing here between the sea and the sky, is that the most valuable things we inherit are rarely the things you can put a price on. It's the stories, the strength, the resilience passed down to us. It's the love that's strong enough to make impossible sacrifices. Many of you who watch these stories have your own lighthouses. Maybe it's not a building. Maybe it's a promise you made to someone you lost. Maybe it's a dream you're fighting to protect from the storms of life. Maybe it's just the struggle to build a home inside your own heart when you've always felt homeless. Whatever your lighthouse is, I want you to know that your fight matters. The work you're doing, even when it's hard and lonely and no one seems to see it, is important. You are the keeper of your own light. Don't let anyone extinguish it. Thank you for walking this journey with me. This channel, this community, is a place for keepers, for people who protect the things that matter. If my story resonated with you, if you believe in fighting for the lighthouses in our lives, then please subscribe and become a part of this crew. And I want you to do one more thing for me. In the comments below, I want you to tell me, what is the lighthouse you are fighting for? You don't have to share details. You can just say, I'm fighting for my family, or I'm fighting for my dream, or I'm fighting for myself. I will read every single one, because your story, your fight, deserves to be seen. You are not alone out there on the point. We're all here, keeping a light on for each other. Thank you for listening.